The following program is a special presentation of the Big Ten Network, produced in association with the University of Wisconsin.
200 years after Charles Darwin was born, his theory on evolution remains the foundation of modern biology. We'll take a look at his life, explore his theory in more detail, and tackle the thorny question of whether Darwin's findings can coexist with religious belief. Next, on Office Hours. The word evolution conjures up images of Charles Darwin, the Galapagos Islands, and monkeys. But where does Genesis and intelligent design fit into this picture? Today, during Office Hours, we have Jeff Harden, the chair of the University of Wisconsin-Madison Zoology Department and a faculty member in the Center for Religious Studies. Professor Hardin has presented on Abrahamic religion's views on evolution and has authored a leading textbook on cell biology. Professor Hardin, welcome. So this year we celebrate what would be Charles Darwin's 200th birthday, 200th anniversary of his birth, and the 150th anniversary of the publication of his seminal work, Origin of the Species. As I've been doing some background research for this, his personal story was interesting to me. Very young man, 22, a man of some means, a son of some means, goes off on the Beagle.
Right, yeah, actually he was an heir to the Wedgwood China fortune. So you're right about the having some means. And yes, then he goes on a 5-year voyage, 1829 to 1834 on the Beagle, going around all of South America. And it's really during that time that he takes copious notes, does lots of sampling of organisms, plants, and animals. And it's during that time that he begins to get an inkling of what will later become his theories about evolution.
So, striking to me, and I guess I never realized this, that he gets back in 1833, 1834 from his voyage. The book's not published for another 25 years. What's going on during that time?
Yeah, well, a lot of us would like to say that if he had had to get his grants renewed, he would have been in big trouble.
Or get tenure.
Or get tenure, that's right. But he didn't have to, so he could be sort of a gentleman scientist in a way. And really he wouldn't have even published in 1859 if he hadn't been rushed to publish by parallel work and thinking by Alfred Russel Wallace. During that intervening period, Darwin is doing several things. He is, first of all, thinking about what he has seen during his Beagle voyages, putting that all together with other things that he knew about, including artificial selection, breeding, those kinds of things, and thinking about what all of that meant. But in addition, he was an incredible letter writer, and one of the things that he was doing during this time was doing sort of one-on-one correspondence with experts in various areas of biology to see whether his thinking squared with what they thought the facts were at the time. And so he's doing a lot of fact-checking, so that's one of the things that makes the Origin so impressive when it comes out, is he has just reams and reams of examples to try to bolster his ideas.
So he has reams and reams of examples. He's taken 25 years to gather some evidence, but when the work first comes out, extraordinarily controversial, right?
It is. I mean, it was a bestseller. The Origin sold like hotcakes. But it certainly was controversial. It was controversial on several fronts. First of all, one of his fundamental ideas, descent with modification, the idea that species change over long periods of time, was at odds with the way some people thought about that. Some people, really going back to Greek philosophy, thought, no, species can't change. They're fixed.
A dog is a dog is a dog.
Exactly right. There might be a little bit of changes, but the broad categories, no, we're stuck with those. And that included a prominent American biologist named Louis Agassiz, for example. So there was some philosophical opposition. Clearly, one of his other ideas, the idea that natural selection could account for changes in organisms and organismal diversity without the need of a designer, was very controversial relative to natural theology and trends at the time, which were dominated by the writings of a fellow named William Paley, who used the analogy of a watch to talk about biological organisms. If we found a rock on the beach, we wouldn't think much of that. Probably nothing special. But if we found a watch on the beach, we would think that, well, someone who had made the watch had left it on the beach, a watchmaker. and God was perceived to be a divine watchmaker, and his watches, as it were these biological organisms.
You mentioned natural selection, obviously a key part of Darwin's evolution theory. Define for me that term.
Sure. Well, maybe we should back up just for a second and say that Darwin uses the phrase descent with modification over and over. So what he means by that is that differences in organisms arise via changes through time, and that organisms are related to one or maybe a few common ancestors. And of course, the engine of change for Darwin was this idea of natural selection. So for him, what this means is that heritable changes lead to differences in the success of organisms. The more successful an organism is, the more tendency there will be for that organism to reproduce. And so the traits associated with that organism will be transmitted to the next generation.
So if I'm a fast wolf, I do better at getting not caught by other wolves, and I do better at catching food, so
you'll be more likely to get together with a female wolf and pass on your genes to wolf pups. That's right, through wolf pups. That's the idea. For Darwin, the selection acts on individuals, an individual wolf, let's say, but what this leads to is changes in the proportions of these traits, these heritable traits in the entire population, the whole group of wolves, to use your example. So that's what he means by natural selection. And for him, an important thing is that there's no obvious purpose involved here. The selection has to do with how well adapted an organism is to its environment.
And this notion of, and we're gonna get back to that in a couple minutes here as we continue our conversation, this notion of no obvious purpose was really what was the most controversial thing. But let me interrupt you here. We'll jump back in the next segment and get into that. And hope you'll all stick with us here as we discuss Charles Darwin, the theory of evolution, on Office Hours.
This program is a production of the University of Wisconsin-Madison. If you have comments about this broadcast, please email them to programming@uc.wisc.edu.
Consider this. There's a public university that consistently ranks among the top in the number of Peace Corps volunteers and in the number of graduates serving as CEOs of Fortune 500 companies, whether they are leading corporations or changing the world. The next time you see people doing extraordinary things, they are probably badgers. The University of Wisconsin-Madison. Forward thinking.
Welcome back to Office Hours, talking with Jeff Harden, talking about Darwin and Darwin's theory of evolution. So as we were finishing up the last segment, you used the term no obvious purpose. That natural selection, a consequence of natural selection, was there was no obvious purpose. Why would that have been such a phenomenally controversial thing at the time?
Well, let me clarify the no obvious purpose by saying that there's no purpose inherent in the mechanisms of biological evolution as Darwin outlined them.
No one with the big plan.
The scientific mechanisms don't have a plan built into them. So there's no obvious blueprint there. And this caused some problems, clearly. And in fact, although within 10 to 15 years of the publishing of The Origin, most biologists accepted some sort of evolution, there was lots of discussion about this plan issue. So Asa Gray, for example, a strong proponent of Darwin in the United States, who was a botanist at Harvard and also a devout Presbyterian, he wrote many letters and corresponded extensively with Darwin about this point. Because he was comfortable with evolution, but felt that at a significant level there had to be some sort of purpose behind it, especially when it comes to organisms like ourselves.
We're going to get to this a little bit more in current debate, but how did he reconcile that at the time, the Harvard biologist?
Well, for Gray, I think he accepted the basic mechanisms that Darwin was proposing, but he felt that for for him, God was shepherding the process of evolution, at least at a very large scale, and so that he was accomplishing his purposes. That's the kind of language he would have used as a theist.
Well, let's talk about the distinction between microevolution and macroevolution. What's the difference between the two? One more controversial than the other, both now and at the time.
Yeah, so it's interesting. So a standard, slightly more technical definition of evolution than the descent with modification definition I gave you earlier is changes in the genetic composition of a population of organisms from generation to generation. And that definition suggests a small scale to the changes, as I stated it. So let's go back to your wolf illustration. You know, wolves are canines, and the changes might be very small between one wolf species and another, or dogs and foxes, what have you, but they're all still canines, and the changes there are not huge. Many people would use the term microevolution to refer to small-scale changes either within a species or between very closely related species. Macroevolution would be the idea, I like to call it the primordial ooze to Albert Einstein view of evolution. In other words, large-scale changes from simple beginnings to the very complex, diverse situation that we have today, in which there are large-scale changes in body plans of organisms, in their complexity, those kinds of things. Darwin, it's not entirely clear from my reading of Darwin, but I think he would agree with many modern evolutionary biologists and would find no distinction between those two. It is the microevolutionary mechanisms that lead to the macroevolutionary changes given enough time and given enough variety in environments and opportunities for adaptation.
Interesting. So we're going to get to a more detailed discussion of the current debate, but if I was sort of to simply or even cartoonishly sum it up, uncontroversial soon after Darwin and currently relationship wolf becomes dog, very controversial monkey becomes man.
Well, it depends on who you talk to about that second point about very controversial.
And we're going to
that's the source of the controversy.
And we're going to jump into that here in our next segment. Please stay with us on Office Hours.
For more than 100 years, the University of Wisconsin has been inspired by the Wisconsin idea,
which says the good work of the university extends to the boundaries of the state and beyond.
So the UW works hard to help build Wisconsin's economy.
Educate people of all ages.
Advance health and medicine.
And enhance the quality of life for all of us.
Hit it!
The University of Wisconsin-Madison. Forward thinking.
Welcome back to Office Hours and our discussion about Charles Darwin and the 200th anniversary of his birth. Jeff sketched out Darwin's personal story, sketched out the basic findings, the basic claims of evolution and natural selection. What's some of the evidence that Darwin provided? What's some of the evidence that's been gathered in the last 150 years to back up his claims?
Sure. So let's start with Darwin himself. First of all, we should say that Darwin was an incredibly careful biologist himself and made very detailed and impressive observations of organisms, and so that comes through in the origin quite a lot. But I suppose if I could lay out the standard kinds of evolutionary evidence that would be in a modern textbook that our freshmen and sophomores here at UW might be reading, there would be several areas that were known at the time. First is the fossil record. So it was already known by the time Darwin publishes The Origin from sedimentary rocks in particular that one could find successions of organisms whose features seem to change over time in correspondence with their position in the sedimentary rock strata. So that was called at the time the law of succession. So in places where maybe one of the most famous examples in the late 19th century would have been the horse. So as one looks at the fossil record, over time one sees a progressive change in the features of horse-like organisms over time. And this was known for lots of different organisms at the time, and Darwin uses that as evidence in The Origin. Second are things called vestigial traits. So Our own tailbone is an example of that. We don't have tails, but we have the first bone of the tail. And most people would count that as a vestige of our ancestors. At least Darwin would have certainly used it that way. And so these make sense if there truly was an ancestor who had the need for the feature, but then that need was lost, and so most of the structure was lost, but we can still see vestiges of the structure even today. And that was hard to reconcile with a special creation of an organism, but made a lot of sense if there was a transition from an organism that needed the structure to one that didn't. Third is what we would call biogeography. You mentioned the Galapagos in your introduction. And Darwin himself showed very nicely that birds on neighboring islands in the Galapagos and other places were closely related to one another. And in fact, they were more closely related if they were on islands adjacent to one another. And that made a lot of sense if there was a common ancestor from which these birds were descended on the different islands. And so the closer they were together, the less divergence there would be between the birds. And this kind of biogeographical data fit very nicely with his theory at the time and was really a linchpin of it. Another thing are things called homologies. So a homologous structure is a structure which in different organisms might serve different functions, but appears to derive from a structure in a common ancestor. So a prime example for Darwin was the vertebrate limb. So he has a very famous quote where he talks about the grasping hand of a man, the forelimb of a mole used for digging, the leg of a horse, the paddle of a porpoise, the wing of a bat. They all have the same bones in roughly the same positions, the same overall organization, and one can identify the very same bones in all of these radically different limbs. It's not obvious why they should have all of these same bones given the radically different functions of these limbs unless they are derived from some common ancestor. That's what Darwin would have said. And so that was strong evidence. And from all of this and from classification of organisms that had been going on for quite some time by the time Darwin started doing his thinking, Darwin himself assembled a tree of life in which he drew out the relationships between various organisms. So that was Darwin.
Okay. When we come back, talked about the tree of life, you've outlined the evidence that Darwin put forward, and there's been subsequent evidence. We're going to talk about whether Darwin's theory, whether the theory of evolution is in fact compatible in any way, shape, or form with people of faith, people of religious faith. Hope you'll stay with us on Office Hours here as we talk about Charles Darwin.
This program is a production of the University of Wisconsin-Madison. If you have comments about this broadcast, please email them to programming@uc.wisc.edu.
Welcome back to Office Hours with Professor Jeff Harden, professor in zoology and also in religious studies. So Jeff, I want to give you some questions with your religious studies hat on in a second. But first, bring up the evidence to the modern era. You talked about some of the evidence that Charles Darwin provided at the time. What is probably the single most compelling piece of evidence or area of evidence now to support Darwin's theory?
Sure. The key thing that Darwin was missing was genetics, which was sort of rediscovered towards the beginning of the 20th century. And so a synthesis ensued between genetics and evolutionary theory, which we would now call the neo-Darwinian synthesis. Since the discovery of DNA, and the massive explosion in our knowledge of molecular biology, what we now know is that those same kinds of relationships that I mentioned before hold true at the molecular level in the very structure of our genes. So we have vestigial structures, but we also have vestigial pieces of DNA that don't seem to have obvious functions, but do have functions in organisms that are similar to us. So this, along with lots of additional genetic and molecular data, has provided additional support for the idea of descent with modification that Darwin talked about.
So at the outset of the show, we said when you think of Darwin, you think of the Galapagos Islands. When you also think of Darwin, you think of the Scopes trial, you think of debates about whether Darwin should be taught in the school or whether creationism should be taught in the school. Mm-hmm. And at the core of those arguments is the assumption that Darwin's theory completely incompatible with religious belief, and that religious belief is completely incompatible with Darwinism. And I know you've thought long and hard about these issues, and I wanted to give you a chance to talk about that here.
Sure. Well, while it's true that, especially in the United States, there's tremendous polarization over this topic, historically, that's not the case. So certainly I mentioned Asa Gray, this botanist from Harvard who corresponded with Darwin. He was a devout Christian, practicing Christian, and saw no incompatibility. Many famous theologians, actually some of them very conservative at the beginning of the 20th century, saw absolutely no issues with at least most facets of evolutionary theory. So historically, I think there hasn't been this polarization that we find ourselves facing today. In the modern era, there is a wide spectrum of opinions on these issues, from very conservative positions where no evolutionary ideas are possibly valid to people who fully embrace all aspects of evolutionary theory and see no problems with their faith commitments of any kind.
What I learned in Hebrew school, what you learned in Sunday school, isn't Darwin. A little less than 6,000 years ago, Adam, Eve, that's the story. How, people of faith, how do you reconcile Darwin in this? So you've talked about these fairly conservative, fairly religious people. It does sort of seem there's a gut incompatibility between the two.
Well, one of the issues is I think we get into trouble when we try to read sacred texts through 21st century Western eyes. And I think that's an area where I think we've gotten into trouble. Of course, the ancients knew nothing about science. They weren't writing scientific textbooks. It's interesting, in The Origin, Darwin quotes Francis Bacon, and Bacon said this, "Let no man think or maintain that a man can search too far or be too well studied in the book of God's Word or in the book of God's works." And so that's maybe a good place to start, to let natural phenomena have their own integrity. That's one of God's works, if you will, and let sacred texts have their own integrity to try to understand them on their own terms. And I think many people have found that these ancient texts do not talk about scientific theories. They are communicating other kinds of truth to us than those that we find in science.
Well, Bacon was a tremendous quote to start. I'm sorry, we have to finish. This is a great, interesting conversation, and very interesting to hear both about Darwin, evolution, and how it reconciles. Thank you very much for being with us today. And thank all of our viewers out there for joining us today on Office Hours, and hope you'll join us next time.
The preceding program was produced by the University of Wisconsin in association with the Big Ten Network.